Hello everybody, welcome to What Magic Is This? Today I will be speaking with a fellow whose work I absolutely adore. And if you're interested in the things that I am, you need to know this man's work. He is the Associate Dean of the School of Humanities and holds the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He is an Associate Director of the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, where he also serves as Chair of the Board. He's the author of several books, including The Supernatural, Secret Body, Authors of the Impossible, Changed in a Flash, and The Flip, many of which are some of my favorite books of all time. There is no one on Earth or elsewhere like my guest for this episode. I am, of course, talking about someone whose work is mentioned consistently on What Magic Is This? Dr. Jeffrey Kripal. Dr. Kripal, how are you? How's your 2020 been?
It's been pretty bad.
Okay.
Yeah, I think like most people, we're ready to see it go, I think.
Yeah, but you're keeping busy and you're keeping your spirits up, though.
Yeah, trying. Yeah.
Perfect.
In isolation like everyone else, so.
Right. Jeff, I have talked about your work constantly on my show. I've done an episode on your metaphor of the TwoWay Mirror. I think with this episode, I really just want people to understand your body of work and what ideas that you've been working on over the last 20 years, basically, or maybe you've been working on them your entire life. But to kick this off, in your book, The Supernatural, you talk about this situation where you're sitting on an airplane and somebody asks you what you do. And you have many answers for this. My favorite of which is you say that you teach weird shit. So people to get an idea, what is this weird shit of which you teach?
Well, yeah, I get asked that a lot. I don't actually have a good answer. That answer doesn't work either, by the way.
No?
They just, yeah, they're offended or they look at me like I'm crazy or something. But I mean, the weird shit, as you call it, or as I call it, is anything anomalous or anything that doesn't fit in to what people presume is the case,
Okay.
whatever their culture happens to be. And these kinds of experiences are universal, frankly, which is, by the way, a very scandalous word in the contemporary humanities. Nothing is supposed to be universal. But these experiences are universal, and they're universal because they're taking things apart.
Right.
They're not putting things together yet, even though I think they're designed to put things together eventually. So that's essentially what I'm talking about. I mean, most people would call these paranormal, occult, magical, mystical. I mean, we have all kinds of bad words for them, but they're basically experiences that don't fit into how we think we work or the world works.
Right. Now, another answer that you say that you might give in this situation is that you say that you compare things.
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, because I don't think enough people that listen to my show or that are involved in the strange stuff of life, they don't know what comparativism is. Can you explain to people what comparativism is?
Sure. So comparativism is a basic cognitive skill that we all have, that we all use every day without recognizing it as such. And it's essentially what the human being does, takes this and that and compares it to some third thing, something that's more fundamental. So you take an A and you take a B and you draw them both back to some C. And in the study of religion, what we're doing is we're taking different religious experiences or different religious stories or institutions, and we're relating them back to some more basic model. And that might be the human body, that might be society, that might be the human brain, that might be some kind of spiritual essence, some kind of soul, might be God. So everyone compares, Douglas, but sometimes, or I think usually, we compare badly.
Right.
Because we presume that RA is primary and that the foreign or other B is secondary or less than RA. And so we end up comparing the B to RA and not to some C, basically.
You have I believe it's the last chapter of your book, a wonderful, wonderful book called Secret Body, which I suggest for everybody to read because it's a bit of a personal story, but it's also a beacon to some wonderful future. But your last chapter is called The New Comparativism. So what would this new comparativism be?
Well, yeah. So what I call the new comparativism actually isn't new. It's quite old. It goes back to the early 19th century, but it's largely forgotten now. And basically how it works is you take the extraordinary or anomalous experiences of the contemporary period,
Mhm.
of people you know or that you yourself have experienced, and you use them as guides to read the ancient or the pre-modern religious or historical texts. And what you realize very quickly is that a lot of the things that we considered to be legendary or made up in the past actually are not, because they all happen in the present if we just look around and listen to each other. And it doesn't mean they happened in the way they're remembered or the way they're mythologized or ritualized, but it means that there's an experiential base to a lot of the folklore and the mythology and the religious belief systems that we just consider today, I think, to be quaint and made up essentially.
Got it. It was through a book of yours called Authors of the Impossible that I became familiar with your work. I believe at some point about a decade ago, there was an article about this book that was in some website. I might have been Boing Boing or Laughing Squid or something, one of those websites back in the day. In this article, it talked about how your book, Authors of the Impossible, was about four individuals, one of whom was Charles Fort. Now, Charles Fort is a bit of a hero of mine. I don't believe that people, it's not that people are reading him incorrectly, but I think that the things that people concentrate on his work aren't the things that people should be concentrating on. So I was able to run to a university bookstore. I was able to find a copy of Authors of the Impossible. And since then, I've just been in love with your work. But I want to ask you, Charles Fort was a gentleman he was a comparativist in every sense of the word. I want to ask, why is Charles Fort somebody you admire and somebody that we should regard as being important in this day and age?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. So, for one thing, Fort worked entirely outside any respectable institution. He was not an academic, he was not a scientist, he was an individual private citizen. And so he wasn't what I would call disciplined.
No.
And I mean that as a compliment.
Right.
His thought and his way of thinking were not already locked down into academic or scientific dogmas. And as a result of that, he was remarkably free in his mind. And so what he basically did was he went to the New York Public Library every day for decades, and he read every journal essay and every newspaper article he could in English or French back to 1800. He just stopped at 1800 because he had to stop
There's
somewhere
too
and
much stuff.
too much stuff. And he collected all of this weird shit, as we said earlier, that was reported in the newspapers or the magazines or journals, but then just dropped the next day and went on to something else. And he started to organize it in actually shoe boxes
Right.
originally,
Yeah.
and he made these little clips. And you could actually still go to the New York Public Library and read his actual notes, which are remarkable.
It's on the bucket
Um,
list.
yeah, but he started to write about this stuff in 1919. His first book on this material was called The Book of the Damned. And what he meant by the damned wasn't what you might think. He meant the anomalous. He meant stuff that were damned because they didn't fit into any system. And the two systems he had in mind were religion and science. And he believed that this material didn't fit into either what we would now call the episteme or order of knowledge, to use academic terms, that this stuff was just outside any religious system and outside any scientific explanation. And because of that, it was really, really important. And it represented where we should be going with our culture and our ways of knowing. And he called these things dominants. So there was the dominant of belief, which reigned for millennia. There was now the dominant of reason or explanation, which is presently reigning now with modern science. And there's this new dominant, which he playfully called the dominant of magic and witchcraft, which was essentially what we now call the paranormal, but which he called the damned. And if you read Fort, the reason I love Fort is he's so funny.
He is.
He makes fun of himself,
Yeah.
and he never quite lands. I mean, you can kind of sense where he thinks he is, but he's not, he knows he's not there. He knows that even his own convictions are not really the case. So he has this incredible sense of reflexivity or playfulness that is just, I think, so rare. And of course, he's often very wrong, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not that Charles Ford is somehow gospel. That would be very unfortunate, by the way.
Correct.
I mean, some of the things he says are just nuts, but so what? Other things he says are just fantastic, and I think basically correct. So you have to read Ford as a Fortian. You can't read him as literally true, but once you do, it's this incredibly intellectually captivating experience.
Absolutely. No, I love the guy, and it's always a joy to read anything. To go back and reread his work, you always find something new. And I know that people say that constantly, but with his books, it's just something that you might have just skipped over and said, oh, that's interesting. Next time you read it, it's like, one, it's very, very eloquent in a weird early 20th century way, but it's also incredibly funny. It's somewhat amazing that two figures that you would devote chapters to in Authors of the Impossible, which would be Frederick Myers and Charles Fort, and there's another two, but they were doing their work at a time when fundamental materialism was being seen as the only real way to apprehend the world. What epistemological hangups are we still suffering from that we've inherited from the late 19th century and the early 20th century?
Well, pretty much all of them.
Yeah.
It depends on who you're talking to, of course. I mean, but I think most of us presume some kind of materialistic worldview, right? That what's really real is matter or stuff, physical stuff, and what's really not real are things like dreams and visions and experiences. And I think that's the basic problem. And so we kind of live in this schizophrenic worldview in which we, as subjects of experience, don't actually exist and are not really real, but where all this other stuff is real. And yet we only know all of this stuff through our own subjective experience. So it's this ironic, just deeply ironic situation we're in, which is frankly absurd and makes no sense once you start thinking about it, but it's what everybody thinks is the case. And then all kinds of things follow from that materialist worldview, including, I think, depression and a kind of meaninglessness and a kind of feeling lost because we have no telos, we have no goal anymore. We're just random matter bouncing around basically. And so I think that's the deepest issue that most people, of course, wouldn't even be able to articulate. But I think that's the case. I think it's absolutely the case.
So they took this separation of mind and matter, and we just basically say that never shall the two meet at any point.
Well, but also matter is what's real and mind is what's not real.
Right.
Mind is a manifestation of matter.
Right.
Mind is just a surface kind of epiphenomenon of this material substrate. And what's really real is this material substrate. And that's why in the universities and on our education today, the sciences are on top.
Yeah.
Because they study what's real. And that's why the humanities, things like philosophy and the history of religion and literature, are on the bottom because they study what's not real.
Right.
So that metaphysics that we assume ends up locking our educations into a particular order.
You talked earlier about meaning, right? And so I have to ask you, why is privileging meaning and story vastly more important than concentrating on getting stuck with attempting to explain the anomalous or the damned?
Right. So I wrote Authors of the Impossible. I finished that in 2010 or 9, somewhere in there. And the reason I wrote it is that I had been sitting in a room at Esalen for years at that point. I mean, I wasn't sitting there for years, but I was coming
meditating. I can see you sitting on a cliff there. And
sitting there. I was coming and going for about a decade or so at that point, engaging in these seminars, which were 5 days long. I'd done dozens and dozens of these, mostly with physicists and neuroscientists and psychiatrists and philosophers. And they were all talking about whether consciousness survives bodily death or not, and they were presenting all the evidence for it. And then they were trying to offer explanations or causal mechanisms for these experiences. And I was I was not the lone, but I was one of the few humanists in the room. And by humanist, I don't mean a philosophical humanist. I mean someone who works in the humanities. And I was always raising my hand and I was saying, but you're looking for a mechanism or a cause to a story.
Yeah.
If you really listen to these stories, what you recognize very quickly is they're stories. Now, they're also experiences, but they're experiences that organize themselves into a narrative, into a story. And obviously, the point of a lot of these stories is to provide meaning and direction or comfort to the person having the experience. And so I was like, why are you trying to look for a material causal explanation to what is essentially a story, a piece of literature? And I became convinced that that was really mistaken and that we would never really understand paranormal phenomena until we abandoned this scientific search for physical causes.
Right.
Just throw it out.
Yeah.
There are no causes. And look at these as living stories that are playing out in the physical world. They're really real. They're really happening. They really involve physical events, but they are not organized by any mechanism.
Right.
They are organized by meaning. And that just blows people's minds because we all assume materialism. We all assume there's a physical cause for everything. And I'm like, nope, there's not. Let it go. You know?
One of my favorite things that you said, I believe it's in The Supernatural, is that, yeah, these things are stories, but they're stories that show up on radar.
Yeah, they do. Right. So, yeah, yeah. I don't do it anymore because of the pandemic, but I used to give this lecture a lot called Biological Gods. And it was basically about the UFO phenomenon. And I always started it by saying, look, there are two things you have to understand the UFO phenomenon. One is radar, the other is revelation.
Right.
And people look at me like, what are you talking? But those are the two things that are really involved in that phenomenon. And there's this physical component, and there's this meaning or revelatory or mystical component. And if you take either one of those away, you will not understand the phenomenon. You will understand part of it,
Right.
but you will not be listening.
Got it. Yeah. To speak on this a little bit more, in the book, the flip, you've put on the table 5 answers to this mind matter problem. You put a panpsychism, you have dual aspect monism, quantum mind, cosmopsychism, and idealism. Now, you say that you're quite a fan of dual aspect monism, and I'm just wondering if you can explain to people what dual aspect monism is and why you think that it's a very important thing for people to understand and might just not explain this phenomenon, but might shed light on the phenomenon itself.
Yeah. So first of all, it's a conversation stopper.
No doubt.
You're at a party and you say, "Yeah, I'm a dual aspect monist." I mean, everybody just walks away, and you're standing alone in the corner, right?
Hey, I tell people I'm a magician. If you and the first question is can you do a card trick? And I say not that kind of magician.
Yeah,
Then they ask, and then they walk out of the room
yeah,
real
that's
quick.
walk away. So actually, dual aspect monism and ceremonial magic are very much related, I think.
Yeah.
So dual aspect monism is the position that when you and I are sitting here talking to one another, we experience ourselves as a mental world looking out on a material world. So we experience ourselves what philosophers call epistemologically as two. In other words, we assume two dimensions of existence, a mental world inside and a physical world outside. What dual aspect monism says is that dualism is only epistemic. In other words, it's strictly a function of a human brain and body splitting up a reality that is in fact one thing. So deep down, to use a metaphor, the world is one. It's all one thing that is neither mental nor material, or if you want, it's both mental and material.
Got it.
It's it's not matter, and it's not mine. It's something that is both material and mental or spiritual at the same time. And when a human being comes along and a brain and a body develop and gestate and are enculturated and socialized, it takes that one reality and it splits it up into this internal subject and this external world, neither of which exist independently of one another,
Right.
but both of which do exist in human experience. So the reason I like this is the simplest way to think of this is a horizontal line under which is the one world, and on horizontal line there's one vertical line in the middle that splits up the mental and the material. If you just think with that simple and certainly inadequate metaphor, you can easily understand why you will never find a material cause for a mental phenomenon, right? Because you can't go from the material dimension straight into the mental. There's no causal connection there.
Right.
They're correlated. Absolutely, they're correlated. But one doesn't cause the other.
Right.
The material doesn't cause the mental, and the mental doesn't cause the material. They're correlated, they coincide. They're both caused, if you will, by this one world down here,
Got it.
but they don't cause one another. Okay? So the way magic works essentially is you're trying to create a coincidence or a correlation between something mental and something material. To the extent that you can get into that unus mundus, I think you in fact can do that.
Right.
But it's naive to think you can go from the mental straight to the material, which is, I think, how a lot of people think of magic.
Right.
And I think that's wrong. I don't think that happens. But I do think mental events and material events are correlated. And this is what we call a magical event or a paranormal event. It always has this physical component that coincides perfectly or almost perfectly with this mental event. And there's no causal connection,
Right.
but they are connected deep down
Huh.
into this unus mundus or this one world. And that's why I like dual aspect monism. It's not that I think it's entirely true or adequate. I don't.
Right.
But it certainly works. It
Absolutely.
explains my ordinary experience. It also explains the extraordinary experiences of the people I talk to. Works perfectly well. If someone comes along and gives me a better model, I'm like, great, I'll take it. But I haven't seen one yet,
Right.
and there are a lot of them out there, by the way. But
Oh, yes.
I just that's the one I happen to usually land on.
Now, this is something that I didn't have in the list of questions that I sent you earlier, but I'm going to ask it anyway. This idea of human beings being the splitters of
Yeah,
mind and matter.
yeah.
What would your idea be that now is it only us that are doing the splitting? Can other animals do the
No, of
splitting?
course not. No, of course not.
Oh,
Any creature or being with a brain and a body is splitting,
yeah.
right? They have to split to survive. Um, that's what a living organism is a boundary or a splitting between the mental world of life and the material world of the environment.
I love it. To speak of these two things, and it's not in a dualistic kind of way, but I've done a full episode on the two-way mirror, which I put out as kind of like an emergency episode. One of my guests they canceled, and I was like, I have to release an episode. So what do I really want to talk about? And I did an episode on the two-way mirror because I find it an incredible metaphor. So I need to get it from you, Jeff. How would you explain the two-way mirror metaphor, and how is it crucial for us to understand the strangeness of these paranormal or supernatural experiences?
Yeah, I think I've only used that once, probably in the supernatural, but I like it because this is a belief of mine. I mean, I have very few beliefs, but this is one. I think that the key question for all of this stuff is the imagination. So I don't debunk or dismiss people's anomalous experiences, but nor do I believe them. And by that I mean, I think that they really happen, but I think the framework or the content of these experiences is being constructed or projected by the person and is not literally the case.
Okay.
So that's what I mean by not believing them. It's not that I don't think that they happened. I do think they happened. I just don't believe the imaginal or visionary content that often the experiencer believes literally. And I have to tell the experiencer, well, I don't believe that. I think it happened, but I don't think that's actually what's there. And so I love the two-way mirror metaphor because it basically says the same thing, that the two-way mirror, you can look into the other room and see something if you're on the right side of it, right? But if you're on the wrong side of it, which most of us are, what you actually see is a reflection of yourself, even though it's literally a window. And I think that religious experiences that are particularly profound kind of do both things. They give us a window into another dimension of existence that really exists, but they also reflect back to us a lot of our own psychological and cultural and social assumptions. And we don't even recognize them as us.
Right.
We think we're seeing something completely alien or other when in fact we're seeing aspects of us that we don't own, we don't recognize. So for me, that metaphor helps people to think about this. It's just a metaphor. Of course, I don't want to literalize it either,
Right.
but it works well to talk about the role of the imagination. Let me just tell you one story here, which I think really captures this. And I've told this before, so I apologize if people have heard it. But I once tried to do a special seminar on the imagination and the paranormal.
Right.
And I invited all of these people whom I deeply admire, whose writings I really read and have thought a lot about. And I asked them to do two things. I said, please come to the meeting with the strangest thing that has ever happened to you, and then develop some kind of theory of the imagination that can help us understand that experience. And what was so striking to me was these are some of the smartest people probably
Absolutely. Yeah.
in the world. Wow, we're talking about people of immense accomplishment and nuance. Every single one of them came with some what I would call crazy ass story. I mean, just your jaw would drop.
Glowing
And
raccoons and
yeah, things like that,
yeah.
glowing raccoons and teleporting honey jars, and
Yeah.
really, really strange stuff. No one had a theory of the imagination.
Right.
No one. No one had even close to a theory of the imagination. And I was just so struck by that. I was like, wow, we all have these experiences or know about these experiences, but we're completely impoverished when it comes to a cultural model for what the imagination is or how it might translate across these realms. We either believe all this stuff literally, which seems silly and leads us into absurdity, or we dismiss it as nonsense and miss the message.
Right.
So how do we sit there? How do we sit in the middle with that two-way mirror of the imagination and look through to the other side, and also, of course, see ourselves in the mirror? How do we acknowledge both aspects?
Right.
And that's really, Douglas, that's really all I've tried to say in everything I've written is like, come on, just do both. Let's be honest.
Everybody looking around to try and find pieces of spacecraft, and it's just like, I don't think you're getting what's actually being taught here. Like
Oh, they don't get it.
we're
But that
constant.
fits their scientific,
Yeah.
worldview.
Exactly. Now, like yourself, I am constantly fascinated by the idea of brain hemispherics and its role in these experiences. Do you think that somehow focusing on the function of each hemisphere of the brain and how it perceives things will shed more light on supernatural phenomena? Like I myself am a huge fan of Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary. I'm no doubt you've read such a book, but looking more at what's going on now with everything, we really are concentrating on a left hemispheric mode where we're just looking at details and we're kind of locking ourselves into a world that the left hemisphere wants to see. I would think that with everything I've read of yours, you're one of those people that tries to privilege something like a right hemisphere perspective. But do you think that trying to understand this might in some way help us?
Well, so I love Ian's work
Yeah.
too. I love Joe Bolte Taylor. I love all this stuff. I think it's it's essentially correct. Now, my neuroscientist friends don't like it because
Oh,
they want to claim every brain function is what they call global, which of course it is. In other words, it involves both hemispheres. Basically, the rule in my academic world is that if an idea or metaphor works, you better destroy it. You better turn it into mush as quickly as possible. And I just think that's silly. I just like, come on, this works. This helps us explain a lot. So with like Ian's work, take comparativism, looking for a gestalt or a whole. That is a right brain function.
yeah,
Or take intuition, or take, visionary, or take myth, take narrative, right brain,
yeah,
primarily right brain functions. Now take causal mechanisms, left brain,
right.
So you can pretty much predict very accurately which intellectual models are going to be privileged and which ones are going to be dismissed in our world with something like McGilchrist's book. I mean, McGilchrist basically says, look, Western culture has been moving toward the left hemisphere for 200-300 years now, and we're so lopsided that it's dangerous.
Yeah,
And he uses a parable from Nietzsche, actually, about the master and his emissary. And basically, the parable goes like this: that there's this king, and he has this kingdom that's so big, he has to send these emissaries out to rule different parts of the kingdom. And one of these emissaries gets a big head and starts to think that he's the king
right.
and that his kingdom is all there is. When in fact, he's just an emissary of this other king. So for McGilchrist, that's a parable about how the left hemisphere is now denying the primacy of the right hemisphere. And by the way, if you read Nietzsche, clearly a right brain thinker.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, oh my gosh.
yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, I just think it's really helpful. It's again one of these models. It's kind of like the two-way mirror that you're talking about. It just explains so much about our present moment and helps us to get beyond it that I want to work with it, even though, of course, I know it needs to be nuanced. I get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I think that a lot of people, when I don't think that those within the paranormal community do enough looking at the hemispherics of the brain. I believe it was in Secret Body where you say, with people who have had strokes, left hemispheric strokes, and they're able to see for a period of time with almost only one hemisphere, they look at people's faces or their body, and specifically with their faces, the eyes get bigger, the mouth gets smaller, and they notice fine details of things where if you look at cave paintings and people will be like, oh, look, they were painting aliens because these things look exactly like the gray aliens. It's like, no, I think perhaps that this comes from a right hemispheric perspective. I mean, that to me was one of those things when I read it, I was like, thank goodness somebody's actually talking about this kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, I that occurred to me actually reading Jill Bolte Taylor, that you know Taylor is this neuroanatomist who had this stroke on the left side of her brain. It essentially shut down her left hemisphere for a while, and she entered these mystical states, which she used Buddhist language primarily to describe. When she's having the stroke, she's actually exercising on this bike in her apartment or house, and she notices that her hands are becoming long and claw-like.
right.
In other words, they look like alien hands. And so I just noticed that, and I was like, wow, that's exactly how abductees talk. And then in McGilchrist, he talks about how the right hemisphere focuses on the eyes and they get big, and the lower half of the face gets really small and insignificant. I was like, wow, that's how abductees talk. And so it's a guess. But I think that's what's happening is the left hemisphere is shutting down and the right hemisphere is coming online. And I don't mean to suggest that these experiences are generated by the right hemisphere, but I think they are mediated by the right hemisphere.
Right.
And so again, we're back to the two-way mirror that we were talking about earlier. And if you read, by the way, Jill Bolte Taylor carefully, it's not clear whether she thinks these mystical states are generated by the right hemisphere or mediated by them. And there are a lot of passages that suggest the latter, although that is not a scientific perspective.
Got it.
And she knows it. And I think that's why she's so careful. But I'm not a scientist and I'm not careful and I don't care. And I think someone should say these things just so they can be heard.
Absolutely. I'm not going to mention any figures, but there are those in certain communities that say, you know what, don't bother going into the humanities, don't bother learning philosophy, don't bother learning poetry, just go into the sciences. So, in the flip, you make the case that it is to the humanities that we must put more effort in order to understand not just strange experiences, but the human experience. Could you elucidate on this a bit further?
Well, this is a long range argument and it's complex, Douglas. It's not just one point. I think a lot of our problems in contemporary society, including our inability to distinguish between truth and falsehood, frankly, is a result of us dismissing the humanities. But it's also a result of the humanities, by the way, which have all also dismissed the distinction between truth and falsehood for many decades now. I'm not just blaming outside people, I'm blaming my own tribe, as it were, and saying, look, folks, we've been denying truth and falsehood for 40, 50 years. Is it any wonder that the public is doing that now and is doing it really badly, by the way?
Right.
They don't do it like you do it, but they learned it from you. So I think the humanities have basically adopted the materialism of the sciences and they have dismissed the ultimacy of consciousness or subjectivity, and that they're essentially putting nails in their own coffin as they do that,
Right.
because they're basically what they're saying is we study nothing. We study subjectivity and consciousness and human beings who actually aren't real. What's really real is matter, is bodies, is physical objects. Well, that's the realm of the sciences. And then you wonder why the sciences are essentially primary now and the humanities are being dismissed. So I think there are really broad political and social issues at stake here. I also think a lot of the intolerance you see in society around religion and ethnicity and race are all functions of ignoring the humanities. Those are all, if you listen to these ideologues in the media, they hate the humanities.
Yeah.
Well, they hate the humanities because they know darn well that if you take the humanities seriously, you would not take their ideologies seriously. So I think the humanities have this prophetic function, as I call it, in society. And to the extent you dismiss the humanities, you dismiss the prophets among you. And you will go down this very dark and dangerous path. That's one argument. The other argument is that the humanities themselves have encouraged this dark path. And they've encouraged it precisely to the extent that they've denied consciousness and affirmed only material bodies or social histories. So it's a complicated argument, Douglas, and I don't want to lay blame just in one or two places. I want to, spread it all around because I think it is spread around. The other thing, and this is another part of the argument, I often like to say, the sciences are just subdivisions of the humanities. And people look at me like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, you know, I've actually never met a scientist who wasn't a human being. Have you? And where does science really come from?
Right.
It doesn't float in from outer space. It comes from human minds. It comes from human beings. Even mathematics, which people assume has some kind of, divine source, is strictly an expression of the human mind.
Right.
It's all human. Science is all human. That's what it is. And if you want to understand science, you better darn well understand the human. I don't think you can separate those two things, although that's exactly what we want to do now. And of course, you can separate them, Douglas, and you can build things like iPhones and these computers and that microphone and your refrigerator. You can build all this cool stuff by pretending that they're separate, but they're actually not. And you will create a society that is very, very dysfunctional in the end if you do that. And I think that's where we're at. I think we're in deep doo-doo right now because of these assumptions.
Right. Now, in the book, The Supernatural, you have an argument. You basically say that supernatural phenomena is banal and quite normal. If we are all having these experiences, and you have talked about in some of your books how you will be doing a speaking tour, or you'll be talking to a group of people, and then afterwards a scientist, somebody who is involved in science, will come up to you and relate an experience to you. And then a little bit later, somebody else will come up and do the exact same thing. So if we are all having these experiences, what is holding back academia and science from flipping, from this flip? And because I think people should be able to talk about these things, right? Like, I don't know why people on an individual basis can come up to you and say, like, hey, I've had this crazy thing happen. What's stopping them from banding together and just basically saying, weird shit has happened to me. I'm pretty sure weird shit has happened to you. You, of course, say, don't worry, it's normal. What's stopping them from coming together and talking about this stuff?
Okay, so before I answer that, I just want to make a correction,
Okay.
a general correction. First of all, I do not think paranormal experiences are normal.
Oh.
And I wish people would stop saying that.
Okay.
Just stop it. And I don't mean you, Douglas. I mean everyone.
I got it.
And what I mean by that is paranormal experiences are extraordinary, and they are designed to catch our attention. They are not supposed to be normal. Okay? Now, it's also true that paranormal events are normal in the sense that they're part of the natural world. I do believe that, and I think that's what you meant.
Yes.
But I think we have to emphasize that these events are designed to get our attention. And if they're not weird and extraordinary, they won't get our attention. So they need to be anomalous. They need to not fit in. That's their whole point. Okay? Okay, so let's put that aside. Now, why are people afraid of talking about these things? Well, for very good reasons. Okay, basically they're afraid of religion and science. They're afraid of these two, what Fort called dominants.
Yeah.
Because paranormal experiences generally don't fit into easy religious categories. They don't follow orthodox lines. They don't behave. Okay?
Right.
On the other side, the scientific side, they're not supposed to happen at all. So if someone comes out and says, I levitated, or this honey jar teleported across the room in broad daylight, and I wasn't on anything, by the way, the scientist, is just going to roll his eyes, and it'll be a he, by the way, roll his eyes, and the religious leader or the religious believer is going to say a demon was involved or something. They're going to demonize the event. So these two dominants that we have, neither one of them are capable of even listening to the story. And so the person knows that on some level, maybe cannot articulate it in a full fashion with Fort's dominance for sure, but knows that. And so it's much easier just to stay quiet and not talk about it. And so as a result, everybody stays quiet about these things.
Yeah.
And then we presume, oh, they're rare.
Right.
No, they're not rare. They're extraordinary, but they're not rare. They're quite common. In fact, we're swimming in these things all the time, but we don't know it because everybody's staying shut up, basically.
Right.
That's the filter. That's the social filter that keeps everything under this pretense that materialism, or in this case, religion, works,
Right.
when in fact neither work
Yeah.
very well. It's just sort of work. It kind of works sometimes.
It wasn't always like this, though, was it?
Yeah, I think it probably, I mean, materialism wasn't always reigning, but other religious
Right.
systems were. And so they were accepting a lot of this stuff, but they were also still demonizing a lot. A lot of people lost their lives, Douglas, for talking about this stuff. Let's not romanticize the past.
No.
And religions have always affirmed what affirms them, but they've always excluded what doesn't affirm them, even if it's religious, right? It's not the correct religion. It's that religion. So yeah, it's not been a pretty show.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
Now, there was a list of questions that I sent you a couple of days ago, and one of them you answered within your reply to my email. But I think it's one of those things where not enough people are looking at this the right way. So I want you to perhaps set the record straight. But in a lot of things that I'm involved with, my proclivities, we'll call it my occult proclivities, the idea of appropriation comes up constantly. And your reply was actually, it's what I suspected. Perhaps I just needed to hear it from somebody else. But this idea of appropriating culture and religion, what is your perspective on that, specifically when applied to things like the magical?
So I think there's three levels here. I mean, I talk about this a lot, so I've sort of developed this. There's a moral level, there's a historical level, and there's a philosophical level, and they're all important. On the moral level, I think the critique of appropriation is legitimate if the borrowing's not acknowledged. In other words, I think we do need to acknowledge how we borrow and adopt from other cultures, and we need to do that, sensitively and honestly, which does not mean uncritically, by the way. There's no such thing as borrowing from another culture without criticism. So there's that level. And to that extent, I accept the critique. On the other two levels, I actually don't accept the critique. First of all, on a historical level, it's appropriation all the way down. Right. There is no original tradition or culture or religion. Does not exist, never has, never will. You can look at any religion, and it's always, always, always a combination of previous religions and previous beliefs. Right. That's what human beings do. That's what religion is appropriation. Okay? So we have to understand that. Then I think on the deepest level, the philosophical level, the whole language of appropriation assumes this materialism that I've been so critical of. Appropriation assumes that we're all local and single bodies and selves, right, and that religions and cultures are objects that we trade in or can buy or purchase or steal or appropriate, like a car thief or something stealing a car, right, which is silly. It's just not true. So, for example, let me put it this way. I was trained in Advaita Vedanta in my graduate days, and the basic idea of Advaita Vedanta is that the ego or the social self is not who you really are. You're this immortal, spaceless, timeless Atman, or self with a capital S. So, okay, if I take that seriously, if I'm really that self, then what is there wrong with borrowing from all of these cultures? Because I transcend all of them. None of them are me. They're all at my disposal. I can create a kind of art form, a kind of bricolage with different cultures because I'm not located in any culture. Okay? If, on the other hand, you believe you are strictly and only located in a single culture or individualism, then of course there can be appropriation in this negative sense. But if you're identifying the human subject as a soul or spirit that's somehow transcendent of culture, much less space and time, then there can be no appropriation in this sense. It just changes radically and instantly how we think of cultural borrowing. And often what I've seen with individuals is they simply find other religious traditions from other cultures more persuasive, right, and more reflective of their own experiences. They're not appropriating anything. They're simply honoring and acknowledging where they see truth. Yeah. And they're operating with a model of the self or soul that is not dependent on culture or history or a particular social identity. And I think that's basically correct. I think there is a part of us that is transcendent. There's also a part of us that is local and social and historical and political and everything else. And I honor that. So I think there are these two levels that are always working, right, and we have to be sensitive to both when we talk about something like this.
Absolutely.
The other thing I'll say, and it's more cultural, it's more US related, but you know what really distinguishes American religious history from a lot of other religious histories is its wild mixing and matching.
Right.
That's what America has been about for many, many centuries. And that's, I think, if American culture has a strength or a virtue, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
That mixing and matching. There just is no such thing as an essence. There is we can imagine that. We can say that there's some essence to American culture that's Protestant or Christian, but look how dangerous that is.
Right.
Look where that gets us.
Yeah.
Whereas if we just affirm this wild mixing and matching, this diversity, I think we're in a much healthier place. So I actually think this language of appropriation is dangerous.
Mm.
And it leads us down the path of fundamentalism and nationalism and essentialism, none of which I think are good things.
No, it's definitely one of those things that gets talked about constantly, and we've had over 100 years of people telling us that we can't compare two things, right? that we can't look at two things and be like, huh, how are they? And that goes back to that comparativism that you were talking about, right?
Of course you can.
Yeah.
Just it's people who believe in essences, who cultural essences say those things.
Yeah.
But there are no such things.
No, I love it. Thank you for that. Now, we've unleashed some vitriol on the academics and the scientists, but I want to bring it down to the less than educated level. We'll just say this: in Change in a Flash, you table in the very beginning of the book the 4 responses to paranormal or supernatural experiences. There's one, which is the hoax. When somebody tells you that they had this experience, you go, well, that's all bullshit. You basically made that all up. I don't believe one word of that. Then you next have the honest misperception, which is, I'm sure that you believe what happened. I'm sure that in some way, yes, you get it. I don't know if I believe it, but I'm sure that you think that this is what happened. The second is the distraction, which is you tell this story to somebody and they go, huh. And then they go back to washing the dishes, watching TV, doing their life things. And then you have the final response, which is called the guiding sign, which is you say, this might actually be a vector into trying to understand a human experience in general. So I have to ask you, how do we start to get more people guided towards the latter of these responses? Because I'm feeling these days we get option number 1 and option number 3 far more than option number 2 and option number 4, if people can try and remember that. How do we get people to the space, the Joe in the street? How do we get them to try and be more excited or into the realm of being able to view these things as being possible?
Let me begin with a side note first.
Sure.
So, first of all, I'm always insisting to my colleagues that they're elitists, and that so am I, that academic work by its nature is elitist, and that's a good thing.
Yep.
When I invite someone into my home to work on my air conditioner in the attic, I want a freaking elitist. I want somebody who knows about air conditioning.
Right.
I don't just grab someone off the street and say, "Hey, go up into my attic and fix my AC."
You are in Houston. You need the AC.
And just fill in the blank. You don't take your car to some woman walking down the street with her dog. You go where the expert is, and your life depends on that expertise and on that elite form of knowledge. So I have nothing against elitist knowledge. I'm all for it. I think it's great. I think it's what makes the world the world. Having said that, I'm actually not an elitist in the moral sense. And I've spent most of my life working with people who are not in the academy and raising up their experiences, which I think imply profound philosophical questions. Right. And so I'm really, really interested in what I call the comparative practices of popular culture. I've spent decades writing about comic books and movies and people's near-death experiences and people's experiences that make no sense to them, that come out of trauma. I think there is no distinction between the elite and the non-elite. I think we're all human beings and we're all the same.
Right.
Now, to your question, how do we get there? I think we just tell our stories. I think more people have to just say, screw the filter, screw your skepticism, screw your religious belief. I'm going to tell my story. And here's my story. And the more people tell their stories, the less this social censor will be in place, and the more we'll be thinking about these stories, and our culture will change as a result. Let me give you a really contemporary example, something I've talked about before on another radio show.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about COVID.
Sure.
Okay. So COVID has involved millions of people going on breathing machines and going into essentially near death states.
Right.
I guarantee you that thousands, if not tens of thousands of those people who come out of that experience and survive it have had near death experiences.
Right.
And I guarantee you those experiences are not being recorded or not being listened to in the media.
Yeah.
They're being framed in other pathological or medical ways, right? Oh, the person was hallucinating. Oh, they were on drugs. Oh, they were this. Oh, they were that. No, no, those were their experiences. And maybe the drug actually helped have the experience, but that doesn't mean the experience isn't real or true. And so I think that's what we have to do. And it has to kind of run all the way through the culture, from people like you doing this podcast, but also up to journalists who are writing these stories for CNN or the New York Times or whoever. It has to kind of go all the way through the culture and change the way we talk to one another and think about one another. And then we'll start changing the worldview,
Yeah.
but not until then.
Right.
And I'll just say this too. I know you already know this, but I think this conversation has already shifted in the entertainment world.
Okay.
If you look at television or film or all these live streaming channels now, they're just filled with essentially paranormal storytelling. So we allow it there, but only if it's fiction.
Right.
What we don't allow is for it to become nonfiction.
Yeah.
And I think that's the step we need to take now, not in a thoughtless way, but in a no. This actually has profound philosophical and scientific and religious consequences, and let's not be afraid of any of it.
Right.
Let's go after it.
Yeah, but people will go through the papers. They'll look through the papers, Jeffrey, and say, "Where's the evidence for this near-death experience?" Well, truthfully, so immediately we go to those who are the experts, the people repairing the air conditioners, right? Like that's
But see that question, where's the evidence? What they really mean is, where is the replicable evidence that can be established in a laboratory? So that's just the sciences using the sciences to dismiss something they can't understand.
Yeah.
That's just a method of knowing. That's a very good method, but it doesn't mean, simply because the scientific method is impotent in a particular area doesn't mean that area doesn't exist or isn't real. It just means you can't apply the scientific method there. That's all.
Yeah.
And so we confuse what science can know with what is real.
Right.
And we conflate or collapse those. And if you talk to a really good scientist, she or he will be the first person to say, don't do that. Don't do that. Science is really limited. It's a particular way of knowing about the world. It can do all sorts of wonderful things, but it is not omniscient. And just because we think A, B, or C today in the sciences does not mean we will think A, B, and C in 20 years.
Right.
If the science is good, we won't. Science is all about proving itself wrong. And people forget that. Science advances by showing how earlier science was mistaken or inadequate or not enough. I think that's all great, but that's how science works, not it's all just matter and it's dead and meaningless and we suck, which is essentially what we hear today.
It's the boring story you talk about in Secret Body.
Yeah, it's boring and depressing, and you can cover it up and make it pretty. You can prettify it, but it's still depressing and boring. And it's not necessarily true. You can't establish that. That's your assumption. That's your philosophical assumption. Science does not equal materialism. Materialism is an interpretation of science.
Yeah.
So I think there's huge issues here, Douglas, obviously, and I get passionate about it because I think we're at a moment where these models are really hurting us. And I mean killing us. And I mean killing other creatures too. I mean, these are not innocent beliefs or worldviews. These are deadly beliefs and worldviews.
Yeah. So that leads me into the inevitable question. How fucked are we if we go on forever relegating extraordinary experiences? But what changes if we actually start paying them the mind that they deserve? Yeah, will we have to eventually march with the damned?
So I think if we take these experiences seriously, where we're eventually led is that the world is alive
Yeah.
and it's like us. That our subjectivity or our consciousness, this sense of me or you, is the way the world is too. It's the way the whole ecosystem is. It's all alive, all the way down and all the way up. And once we recognize that, I think a lot of our behaviors will just no longer make sense,
Right.
and they'll become pretty horrific,
Yeah.
actually, and we'll change our ways. But I don't think we'll change our ways as long as we think everything's dead and can be used and sold and traded and it's just a transactional kind of thing. I think we'll just keep destroying the world. So I think these experiences are of immense importance, but they're not enough. You know, I'm not suggesting that they're everything. They're just one catalyst to get us somewhere else. I think there are other catalysts
Right.
that are probably a lot more important, you know.
Yeah.
But it just happens to be what I work on. I mean, this is my job. So
Right.
when people say, "Why do you do that?" I'm like, because it's my job. It's what they pay me to do. uh, so yeah, let me do it, you know. But it's not everybody's, it's almost no one's job, by the way, which I think is unfortunate. I think that's another answer to your question. I think we should be paying people to do this. I think we should be hiring people to do this. I think we should be, well, here's a thought.
Sure.
Every time I watch a documentary about NASA, I get sad.
Oh.
And the reason I get sad isn't because I don't like NASA. I love NASA. I think NASA is one of the most wonderful things the United States has ever done, ever. I think
Agreed.
it's probably the greatest thing it's ever done.
Yeah.
But it was really, really expensive. It took up a huge amount of our GNP,
Yeah.
you know? And good. I'm all for it. So what makes us think we're going to solve any of these problems if we don't invest similarly in their research and development? And it's not going to look like NASA, folks. We're not going to be building rockets. But I'm telling you, Douglas, there are a handful of people in the world who think about these things. And they do it because they have day jobs and don't have to worry about a roof over their head.
Right.
That's not going to work. You know, we have to invest tons and tons of money and institutional resources into these questions over many, many generations to get a better answer. We can't just rely on weird professors of religion or, you know, parapsychologists hired by these private institutes to do this, because nobody will listen and it won't go anywhere.
Right. In your estimation, how long till the next dominant?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think this one has to fail pretty spectacularly first, which
It's not working out so good though, man.
it's not. Maybe it is failing. Maybe that's the silver lining here. I don't want to again romanticize
Yeah.
people's sufferings because I know it's suffering, but the paradigm clearly is not working for a lot of reasons, and generally something has to break
Yeah.
before you put it back together in a different way.
Is the universe a giant story? Is the universe alive?
I think it is. Yeah, it's definitely alive, and it's definitely telling stories, but it's telling stories. You know, that's kind of the key. But yeah, it's definitely alive, and I think, and here's the thing. You know, gets back. This is Eric Wargo on steroids, or maybe it's Philip K. Dick. I think the storytelling's partly coming from the future, and I think that's kind of the key. for us to turn around and stop believing in the past and start listening to the futures. To me, that kind of encapsulates the whole thing. Just turn around. Just turn around. You can respect the past, you can listen to the past, but don't believe it. Listen to the future and see where we can go next, not where we've been. Because our cultures and our religions have been pretty immature, frankly. And they've been important and they've given us all kinds of things, but let's not stop there. But that's hard. That's hard for people to hear, and it's
It
hard for
is.
people to do, you know?
Yeah. We're on our way, though. I think you can see that we're starting to see this. At least I can. I mean,
I hope so.
yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Jeffrey. This has been almost near a religious experience for me. I have to ask, what's next for you? You've talked about, I believe it was an interview you did last year, that you're just tired and maybe you don't want to write anymore for a little bit, but I don't believe that for a second. You talk about a trilogy of books called The Super Story, Science Fiction, and some eminent mythologies. Are you still working on this? But yeah, what's next for Dr. Jeff?
Yeah, I have to write to stay sane.
I hear you.
I won't say happy because I'm not sure anyone's happy, but I certainly have
I can tell you I'm happy right now, Jeff. This has been amazing.
The Super Story trilogy, it's one of these grand things that an aging academic
Oh,
dreams up,
yeah.
but it's very sincere. It's essentially a trilogy that goes through the last 200 years of the sciences and tries to show how the sciences are really shaping a new religious imagination. I'm really fascinated by the sciences and their impact on the religious imagination, and vice versa, frankly. A lot of scientists have had these anomalous experiences and have done their science out of them. So I'm interested in this relationship between the paranormal and the sciences. And the Super Story is essentially about that. The first volume's on cosmology and what we call the fine-tuning problem, which I don't think is a problem at all. I think it's a promise.
Yeah.
And the second volume's on evolutionary biology, and the third volume's on what we call eschatologies, but also technology and how technology is changing us.
Right.
So it's an attempt to, again, just do what I've been doing for a long time now, is trying to figure out what's emerging and what new mythologies are developing and how the sciences and science fiction in particular are really key to that emergence.
You said a bit earlier before we had the mics on that there's a book that's coming out before the Super Story, or yeah,
Well, yeah. So, yeah, you always not you, but I sit down to write a book and another one comes out. It's
yep.
very embarrassing.
Yep.
It's embarrassing, but it is what it is.
Yep.
And so I sat down to write the Super Story trilogy, and this other book is coming out now, and I just have to honor that. It's called Teaching the Superhumanities.
Cool.
It's basically about how the humanities have always had these superhuman dimensions in their most canonical writers, but we've suppressed them and ignored them and forgotten them. And that if we can recover them, we can renew the humanities for a new generation as the superhumanities. And that has problems, which I don't want to walk around. I want to walk right through them. And so the book's about that. It's essentially a way to set up the trilogy and a way to talk about the humanities as a whole that I think will be attractive to people, but will also honor the criticisms and problems that come with it. So that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Is there a release date for that? I know maybe.
No, there's not even a book yet. It's.
Are you telling me that I might have to go a year before I read another Jeffrey Kripal book? Is this what you're saying?
More than a year, Douglas.
Oh.
I think.
Well,
I'm sorry, we're very slow.
Fair enough, man.
Yeah.
This has been fantastic. Where can people find your work? Everything's available. Where everything's available to you. Are you still updating jeffreyjkripal.com? Or?
So I update that about once a year. It's about time now for another update, but that's the best source for sure. It's where all the books are summarized, and you can just get them all wherever you buy books. I don't want to pitch any particular way to get a book, but the Flip, by the way, just went audio. So that's kind of cool.
Did you did you read it, or did
no,
they didn't
read it.
Oh.
We picked though. I my family and I picked the reader.
Oh,
They gave us options, and so anyway, that just came out as audio, so you don't even have to read a book. You can just listen to it in your car now,
right.
and
Wonderful.
it's short.
Yeah, it's a short but sweet book. Jeffrey, just so you know, I also do voice recordings. I'm just kidding.
You do?
No, I don't.
I,
But
I didn't know that.
I wish.
Good for
No,
me.
no. Well, maybe I just started now. But no.
Yeah,
Jeff,
you can get voice talent.
yeah, you never know. Hey, I used to do it back in the day. I used to do commercials. So
Really?
yeah, I used to be an actor.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, this has been such a fantastic experience. Thank you so much for your time. And I don't even think I scratched the surface with this, but I would love if sometime in the future I was able to ask you to come back on the show, you would.
Oh,
Because
sure. No, I'd love to, Douglas. Just let me know when. Yeah.
perfect. Jeff, thank you so much for being here and for sharing so much of your thoughts, and hopefully we're going to get everybody, because I know I mention you so often on the show. People are like, yeah, Doug's talking about that Jeffrey Kripal guy again. I'll just get that other book. But
He's a real dingbat. He exists, you know. He's like a real guy. Yeah.
yeah, but hopefully we're going to get your books into everybody's hands, because I think they need to be read, and I hope that this episode has convinced people. So I will have links to all of Dr. Kripal's work. Those links will be in the show notes on whatmagicisthis.com. The show notes for this one, they're going to be pretty Kripal heavy, but that's kind of the point of this episode. So whatmagicisthis.com. Also there, you can find a way to subscribe to my podcast on iTunes or Spotify or any of the places that you can get podcasts. If they have podcasts, I'm going to be listed there. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, and as well as my Facebook account. If you like the show, please leave a review on either iTunes or Stitcher or any of the places that you can leave a review. That would be greatly appreciated. And also, if you like the show, tell a friend. Tell a friend. It is the season for sharing, so why not share the gift of the wonderful world of What Magic Is This podcasts? That would be greatly appreciated. Also, I have a Patreon account. It can be found at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. It's only $7 a month. $7 a month, and there's some exclusive content on there. I've done an episode about Hecate, about one of my favorite books of magic, which isn't really a book of magic, but anyways, there's also videos on there. They're not just videos of me talking towards a camera. I actually go through ways in how to craft things or even set up an ancestral altar, and there'll be more of those as the months go on. All of that stuff can be found at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click one of the Patreon links there. If you're not feeling the whole pay once a month thing, I hear you. So I also have a way to donate any amount of money on whatmagicisthis.com. There's a little PayPal me button. Just click that, and you will be able to donate any amount of money from $5 to $10 to $20 to $40 to et cetera, et cetera. Any amount helps, and it all goes into helping this show and how it runs, because this is about all I have right now. But anyways, I'm loving it, and it's all good. So if you have joined Patreon, thank you. If you have yet to join Patreon, come join us. Or if you want to donate some money, PayPal me. All of that is available on whatmagicisthis.com. Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time, and I wish you nothing but the best for the rest of the year and for the beginning of next year as well.
Right. Let's get a new year.
Yeah.
We need a new year.
Absolutely. So that's the program, everybody. Thanks for listening to What Magic Is This? My name is Douglas Batchelor, and come on back. We're going to talk about this crazy, weird, occult, super story, super humanities stuff. Until then, I want you to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.